So far we've been talking about things that we believe as though our beliefs are all individual items of belief. A particular fact, like the cap on this pen is blue, or God created the world, or any number of millions of other things that you would hold as true. But the other thing to understand is that our knowledge fits these facts together in patterns. So our knowledge is not just a laundry list of individual beliefs, but our knowledge is actually like networks of belief that fit together with each other. And this concept that there is both a structure to our belief and also that there are individual beliefs is a really important feature of epistemology and an important feature of what's going on in our time today. One of the ways that this has really come into our consciousness is through the book by Thomas Kuhn called Structure of Scientific Revolutions. That book should be on your list of things that you know about, because he's the one who originated this concept of the paradigm.
Oh,
The paradigm.
we were talking about.
So, a paradigm in the scientific world is a way of viewing things that sort of is macroscopic rather than itemized. We said before there's the Galileo story with the heliocentric, sun-centered versus geocentric, earth-centered solar system. Those are two different paradigms. And you could think of many, many, many examples of this. Another example of this is a debate that isn't well known, but equally illustrative of this idea. You know, throughout the whole Earth, there is in the record of the layers of sand, rock, a kind of black, dark layer. And people assume that there was some great big event that happened in this layer, that there was some kind of an event that threw so much ash into the air that it all settled everywhere on the Earth at the same time and created this one layer that goes around the whole globe. If you look at the strata of rock, scientists believe that's about 60 million years ago. And they tie that to the death of the dinosaurs. And one of the reigning hypotheses is that there was a really huge asteroid that came and struck the Earth and threw up so much silt and sand and dust into the sky that it literally blocked the sun out for years even. And during that time there was a huge die-off of lots of different living organisms. And you can see this trace of this little thing that goes all the way around the world. It's in the rock columns everywhere. But there's an alternative theory about how this happened. There's another group that says it wasn't an asteroid, it was a series of volcanic explosions. And this went on for, a period of several years, and these explosions were like nothing the world has ever seen. They threw up so much dust into the air that it blocked the sun for multiple years, and there was this huge die-off, and the dinosaurs died, and only the cockroaches are left, basically, and viruses. Well, what you've got is a whole set of facts and two fundamentally different paradigms that gather those facts into a meaningful model. Does that make sense? So the question of how to deal with these different models is obviously very important in science, because there are a number of scientific issues where they used to think this way about it, and then suddenly there was this flip, and they now think of it that way. And of course, Thomas Kuhn, in his book Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is trying to describe and explain why we go from one paradigm to the other. How does the paradigm shift work? Now, one of the interesting things about the paradigms is that you can have situations where both paradigms actually explain all the relevant facts, or at least most of the relevant facts. And so that creates the dilemma. Like, you've got this paradigm over here, which is the sun-centered solar system, and you've got this paradigm over here, which is the Earth-centered solar system, the idea that the sun revolves around the Earth. And you've got these two very different ways of looking at them, at the data of the world. And the question is, which of these is right? Because they're in conflict with each other. They can't both be right. Does that make sense? Now, to us today, it seems obvious that the sun-centered solar system is true. Seems just obvious. Nobody doubts that, except for just maybe a tiny few people, and we usually say that they need help. But did you know that at the time of Galileo, these two models both successfully explained all the data we had? So there was no factual reason why this is obviously true and this is obviously false. In fact, it was actually 150 years-ish before we began to gather enough data that said, you know what, definitively, just from the point of view of data, that this is right and this is wrong. So Galileo was like 150 years ahead of himself there in supporting this idea. Here's an example of that. One of the interesting things about the solar system is that if you track Mars, that you'll see Mars going along like this from night to night to night, and then it'll stop and it'll back up, and then it'll go this way. So that's called the retrograde motion of Mars. You know, the Mars backs up, basically. Well, now that's a fact that these two paradigms have to explain. The sun-centered solar system explains this, and this is a little complicated to explain verbally, but if we had a model of the solar system, it'd be a little easier to see. But imagine that we on Earth are swinging around the sun, right? And Mars is over there, and we catch up with Mars, and then we pass Mars. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, from a sun-centered solar system point of view, this idea that Mars appears to stop and back up and then start going again, well, we can make sense of that because we're on a moving platform. That's the key point. Now, what does this group say about it? Because this posits that we're not on a moving platform, we're on a stable platform. And so why is it that Mars, does this, and then it's back, and then keeps going? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. How much energy would it take to stop Mars from its orbit and back it up and get it going again? I mean, it's astronomical, right? What would that even mean? Furthermore, if you successfully stopped Mars and it was no longer moving forward, what would it do?
Shoot off.
No, not off. In.
Oh yeah, because it's being pulled from the.
Because the gravitational force of the,
So.
well, in this case it would be the Earth,
With Earth.
would pull it in. Right. So the fact that it's not flying off in a straight direction is because there's gravitational pull, but the fact that it's not getting sucked in is because it's got momentum. That makes sense? So here's what the geocentric folks said. Mars goes along like this, and then it does a little loop like that. Little loops.
Huh.
And sure enough, they worked all the details and the mathematics out, and they were able to explain these little loops in such a way that the retrograde motion of Mars fit the model perfectly. Case closed. The Earth is the center of the solar system. These are little epicycles. And they worked out a very complex system that explained all the stuff that they observed by these little curlicues and whatever. Today, this idea is like, okay, that's not a good solution. That doesn't make sense to us anymore. But what's important is this model explained all the facts. Okay? Now let's transpose this idea of paradigms, or there are lots of other terms for them, right? They could be paradigms, or noetic structure is another way of describing it, or conceptual scheme, or an intellectual framework. Lots of ways of thinking about these sort of macroscopic ways of viewing things. But what if, instead of talking about a scientific model that's trying to explain the data of the physical universe, we transpose this into the world area of worldviews? What if we make this atheism and Christianity? Well, now we have a situation, if you follow the logic, where some people might say that atheism explains everything, and Christianity explains everything, and we're stuck. Perspectivalism, this big word here, which I'll be honest with you and say I made it up. I tried to debate whether to call it perspectivism or perspectivalism, and I wanted it to be more complex, so I chose perspectivalism. I'm defining this as a theory about the relationship between perspectives. This is one perspective, this is another perspective, which says that these perspectives are, here's the fancy word, incommensurable. That is to say, they do not share facts, and they do not share rules. They are just two completely self-contained, separate ways of viewing the world, and there's no way to know which of the two is right. If that's the case, then our choice to follow Jesus and to live out the moral guidance of the Christian way is just a sheer coin flip choice, right? So is there a way for us to look at two macroscopic religious worldviews to find something in common and to make a reasoned choice as to which way to go? Comment.
Yeah, for the purposes of this, does it matter what the other circle is for Christianity? Like, would Islam be a third circle that doesn't overlap anything, or is it a circle that partially overlaps Christianity and doesn't overlap atheism?
Beautiful question. Yeah, for purposes of our presentation here, I'm making it simple by using two, but there are, of course, multiple worldviews and religions, probably a dozen or so that have classically been suggested and defended and lived out. And the question of whether we should think of Islam as, something like this, completely separate, or we should think of it more like this, that's an interesting debate. Some people would say, well, you believe in one God, Muslims believe in one God, Jews believe in one God. There's a football overlapping there. And that's kind of the way I would think of it. But if you were really into this, you would say, okay, there is a concept of God or Allah, and the language, the word might appear in both worldviews, but what you mean by that is so different that actually there's no overlap here. That wouldn't be my tendency, but if you're really committed to this kind of a thesis, you could go down that path.
In a process of figuring it out, the first two circles would be atheism and theism. And then from there, assuming a person could come to a conclusion, then you get to Islam, Christianity, Taoism, whatever.
Right, so it might be that if this is a theism thing, so that there is a God, that would be a more parallel opposite to atheism. And then within atheism, you might have, within theism rather, you
Right.
might have different versions of, yeah. And I
The person has to come to that conclusion first.
Right. I agree with that, 100%. All right, so this idea of perspectivism is really suggesting a kind of relativism of perspectives. So you have your point of view, I have my point of view, there's really no way for us to decide. A kind of relativism of perspectives. And that is what I mean by this idea of perspectivism. Okay? Now, I think that in our world today, in our nation, we're actually seeing this play out politically in ways that haven't been true in previous generations. In previous generations, those who were a little more left-leaning, who thought big government was helpful and good and better, and those who were a little more right-leaning, who thought big government was to be challenged and was dangerous and risky, you know, they nevertheless kind of shared a view that we should think these things through in a reasonable way, that we should think rationally about these things, and that, you know, there's some common ground that we could reach, some common perspectives that we could share, and that we could figure out how to work this out together as a nation collectively. So not too long ago, I saw a picture of a t-shirt that you can buy, which says, "I believe in science, progress, I love immigrants and refugees, I love the free press and free thought, and everything that you could think of that would be true of the far left perspective politically was on this t-shirt." And as you went down the t-shirt, the letters got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The biggest word at the top was science. Now, I thought that t-shirt was really, really interesting, because if you had an opposite t-shirt, what would you put on it? You would put on that t-shirt, "I don't believe in science, and I do believe in religion, and I do believe in God, and I don't know." This is a way in which our intellectual elite are starting to segregate into two patterns of thought. And they are offering to us as Christians these two macro patterns of thought. My problem with this is I agree with some of the things in this list, but not everything necessarily. And I agree with some of the things in this list, and not necessarily everything. And the options that are being presented to me as a believer, like, I don't agree with either of these options. Because people on the left are saying, "We believe in science." What do you think they're assuming about us?
Don't.
That we don't believe in science, that we don't believe in thinking, we don't believe in understanding. We are just emotional only. Now, I believe we need to be emotional and relational and connected in intimacy. This is very, very important. But the reason I want to connect intimately with God the Father is because it is true that God the Father loves me, that He created me, that He has a purpose for my life. So science and faith need to fit together in my way of thinking. And the way politics puts this out, this isn't really true. So I'd like to suggest a source for you. And the source I'd like to suggest is from Tim Keller, called "How to Reach the West Again." It's a short little book of 60 pages or so, and I think it's brilliant. And in there, he quotes a guy from Christianity Today who argues that there are sort of two versions of the way people think about about the good life today. These two versions are moral conformity and self-discovery. The options before us are moral conformism, meaning the best way to experience the good life is to embrace tradition, to embrace the past, to embrace what we have learned from history. We want the wisdom of the ages. The world would be better if people respected the authority, particularly the authority of God. And we need to conform our lives, to shape our lives with the wisdom of the past, the wisdom that comes to us through the Bible or through some other religious source. So Muslims could agree with us here in this idea. In the path of self-discovery, human flourishing, the good life, living a great, happy, beautiful, wonderful life that is meaningful and purposeful comes as you reject received tradition. And if you think about it, these are the options that our culture lays out for us. The world would be a better place, says self-discovery, if religion was undermined, if tradition was thwarted. The world would be a better place if we could decide for ourselves freely what is right and wrong. We want to open up to everyone our own way of life. You choose your own way, and that's the way to experience human flourishing. The norms of society, the norms of community, the norms of culture from the past are the problem, says the self-discovery person, and instead of conforming to that tradition, you should reject that tradition and instead make your own way. Live life the Frank Sinatra way. I did it my way, right? Now, what I think is interesting in this context is a couple of things. That these folks here believe that reason and science and all that kind of stuff belongs only to this group. That it is the possession of this group that is throwing off the principles of the past. And what that implies, like the t-shirt, is that this group must be anti-reason and anti-science. Furthermore, I think what's interesting about this is that the result is that in this category of people, you have more and more people for whom the idea of being connected with the church becomes more and more unthinkable. They cannot imagine finding a way to live through the teaching of the church. This is borne out in statistics. Over 20 years, from 2000 to 2020, the number of people who are Democrats or Democratic leaning who are also part of a religious faith has dropped by 25%. So if you're politically left-leaning, this whole way of thinking has captured reason and science for the left and has said, if you're religious, you're over here. And that means that half the population in the United States is, in a way that was not true in the days of Billy Graham, half the population in the United States cannot imagine themselves connecting with the church. I think that has significant implications for campus ministries, Jack, and others of you who are working at Mizzou, for church life, pastors, for all of us. So I'd like to take just a moment here and see what you think about that and what are your responses and thoughts about how this is playing out in our culture.
I think it has implications as a nation,
Okay?
not just what we get faced with at church, but I think more and more and more as the population runs away or discards or just rejects God,
Yeah.
it's going to have national impacts as well.
I think we've done a disservice because we're in some ways, we have pushed that forward, the number one of well, we're not really gonna listen to science, we're not gonna think, we're not gonna reason and ask questions that are hard to answer, I love the beginning here, just, how do I know my reality is true?
Yeah.
And so we've communicated that either by omitting, shutting down some of those answers, or I've done it myself, of just I don't wanna go there, It's really, really sad.
Yeah.
Because they're not mutually exclusive at all.
They're not mutually exclusive, but what I hear you saying is that maybe we are playing into this division a little bit as
Fear.
believers.
Or, some people, not everyone, but
No.
you think that
No.
there's sort of a fear that if I let one thing go, the whole thing will come down.
Okay, that's interesting.
I think too, number two, I think it's more common in developed societies
Absolutely true.
because I work with a lot of immigrants
Okay.
that come from war, poverty. And it's interesting how I've discovered that poverty can be a blessing and that it makes you more needy of God. So as the American church might be diminishing in number, I'm noticing that there's an increase of we see the American church as those who are coming here. There are a lot of churches being formed amongst immigrants that come from those countries. So this is very much a rich first world issue.
Middle class to upper class kind of issue.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. So thinking about that element of American culture, what are the different, who tends to be here, who tends to be here? If you're a person of color, you tend to be here. If you're a person who is Anglo, you're more likely to be here, okay? It's not a 99% versus 1%, but there is a percentage difference, okay? If you're college educated versus high school educated, where do you think it lands?
Number two.
Number two.
College educated, high school educated, yes. Blue collar, white collar. Blue collar, white collar.
Yeah.
So there are social patterns that follow this. Now, if you work in the intellectual elite of our country, so you are a university professor, you are an editor or a newscaster on the news, you are an editor of a major newspaper or a journalist in a major newspaper, you are in the C-suite of an American corporation, where will you be? Probably two, generally, with exceptions. Savannah Guthrie, bless her, wrote a book on this point of view, and that was what shocks us, right? So these are very broad patterns. When I said that over 20 years, 25% drop in the number of people who are Democratic leaning and their connection to church, what's interesting about that, I think, is that the majority of that decline came in mainline churches and Catholic Church. Does that surprise you?
No.
Yeah, because this group comes more mainline and this group comes more from conservative churches, which makes all the sense in the world because conservative churches are conserving a past authority, namely the Bible. And mainline churches are, we're going to borrow the Bible where it's helpful, but our job is to be relevant to the contemporary culture, right? So you see these patterns emerging. I think the question for us then becomes, if we believe in authority, how do we break out of this logjam and create ways of articulating and expressing and engaging with people such that somebody who comes out of this world can see, wait a second, you're a thoughtful person, and yet you still hold to authority. And that is a challenge, I think, for us. Comment in the back.
I think one of the things, I think thinking one, that there's an interest, it's interesting to ask from like a global perspective, you know, kind of how this fits in, because, you know, where you are in the world and what your tradition is going to inform this quite a bit. And as I was thinking about that, projecting tradition, one of the things I think is kind of interesting is that we're getting to where this isn't new anymore. That this is something that's been around for a while. And one of the things that I guess is kind of curious for me as I look at this, particularly as a younger person, is as this self-discovery isn't, you know, rejecting tradition, but there's now this tradition of self-discovery. And
It's
this
creating a
idea
new
that-
tradition.
Yeah, that I'm inheriting the tradition, I mean, to speak in some sense, to inherit the tradition of the revolution.
Yeah.
And I guess it's curious then to see how that kind of plays into this, where it's not just, you know, a rejection of tradition, but really kind of a supplanting of, and hey, there's a different traditional line.
Okay, that's a great way to think of it, because the liberals of the past generation become the conservatives of the new generation. Liberating us from a past tradition, create a new tradition, now we conserve the new tradition, not the old tradition. I think you're right about that. All right, I want to just wrap up by saying, why would we not hold to this idea of perspectivalism, which is that there are these two different ways of thinking, and that they are incommensurable, that they don't overlap, and we're stuck? Okay, we want to say, is this perspectival idea the final word? Is it the case that you choose Christianity or Islam or atheism or Taoism just because you choose it, or just because your parents believed it, or just because your parents didn't believe it, which would be the other option? You know, is it an arbitrary kind of faith choice, or is there reason that can help us? Okay, one of the things I want to give you is 3 reasons why this concept of perspectivalism is false. It's inadequate, okay? Here's the first one. This comes from a guy named Donald Davidson. Let me erase this. I can write them up here. This comes from a guy named Donald Davidson. And his claim is that the very idea that there are these incommensurable paradigms is incoherent. It doesn't make sense. So this idea is basically saying that a perspectivalism is incoherent. You cannot really say it coherently. Let me give an illustration of this. Let's suppose I have 2 worldviews. I'm going to call them A and B. And for me to say that perspectivism is true, what I need to be able to say is they have nothing in common. There are no common facts. There are no common rules of evidence. These two are just radically distinct from each other, and that there's no overlap, no way for us to make a reasoned judgment about which of the two is true. Now, in order for me to make that statement, in order for me to even say that A and B have absolutely nothing in common, that would require that in my mind I have a pretty good sense of what A is all about, and in my mind I have a pretty good sense of what B is all about, and I'd have to understand them both and evaluate them on a common grid and say, nope, they're totally different. But did you hear the phrase, evaluate them on a common?
Right.
So I'm already denying in the process of making my judgment what I'm asserting. Does that make sense? So even saying, I know these two well enough to understand they're opposite frameworks that have no common ground, but that judgment process requires common ground.
Yeah. Just like when a kid says the opposite of an apple is an orange, but potentially the opposite of an apple is a star or a plant.
Okay, that's a great comment. Yeah. Yeah. Strictly speaking, the opposite of an orange is not orange.
Yeah, because the star would still have matter.
Yeah. Stars and oranges actually have stuff in common, like atoms, for example. So that's kind of a metaphysical example. This is an epistemic example. But the very process of thinking about this, requires some common ground. So here's a common story that people tell. It's the story of the 5 blind men and the elephant. Do you know this one? Yeah. Everybody knows the story. Okay, great. So you got the 5 blind men. One guy feels the trunk, one guy feels the ears, one guy runs his hands across the side of the elephant, the other guy holds his tail, the other grabs a leg. The guy who grabs the leg says, "An elephant is like a tree." And then the other guy grabs his trunk and says, No. Elephant is like a fire hose, you know. And, no, but elephant is like a rope. He's got a hold of his tail, and so on. You see, 5 different perspectives. They're completely incommensurable. They have nothing in common. There's no way for us to adjudicate this, no way for us to understand or reason or think, you know, like which one might be better than the other. There's a problem in that story, and the basic problem is there aren't 5 perspectives, there are 6 perspectives. In the process of telling the story, I am adopting what? The narrator's perspective, which encompasses the 5 more limited perspectives, and which makes perfect sense out of the fact that they're not in agreement with each other. And I can do that because I've stepped back and I've seen the whole. So that parable is often used to try to prove, well, relativism. You know, everything is kind of like different points of view, and that's it.
David, if I may, real quick, page 184 and 185 as an endorsement for the book is the elephant myth. And then secondly, if you would just quickly say what you told me about how this has been helpful to PhD students.
Sure.
Just tell that real quick.
Sure. So one question has emerged, like, you know, what's been the value of this pattern of thinking as we've laid out a good method for theology? And over the years, I've gotten a number of emails from PhD students who come from an evangelical background who are earning a PhD in a non-evangelical context, and everybody thinks differently than they do, and they begin to wonder, like, am I the only one? And I must be crazy, because after a while, just the social pressure gets to you, right? And as they've read this, they have said, okay, this settled me down. I can, you know, manage this environment because, yes, indeed, the Christian worldview, based on the authority of the Bible, makes sense. So that's been a great encouragement to me to get literally dozens of these emails over the years from students who are in the Mizzou type environment that some of you work in week by week. All right, so this is the elephant story. Let me tell you a second, or talk about a second reason why I argue this perspectivalism is false or inadequate. The idea, I would say, of total relativism is false or incoherent. Now, it is helpful for us to understand the concept of relativism and how it works, so even relativity physics. So let's do a quick example of this. Let's suppose that in the universe there are only 2 objects, a box that we will label A and a box that we will label B. Okay? There are no other objects in the universe. That's the only thing, those are the only things that exist. Now let's suppose that time passes and then you have this scenario. Okay, so A is smaller, B is larger. Which is the more accurate way of describing the change? Did B get larger or did A get smaller? Which is the right way to describe it?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that's pretty good.
You have to have something else outside of it to determine it.
Bingo.
Yeah.
And if nothing else exists in the universe, there is no meaningful way to say A got smaller is a better way of describing this than, quote, B got larger, unquote. Yeah. There's no way to say. It has no discernible truth value, right? Unless you have a ruler which is stable through time, and then you could say A got smaller relative to the ruler, but you can't really say it unless there is some kind of standard. I think that principle of the standard is one of the really interesting things about this kind of evaluation, and in apologetic contexts, people often forget that they have a ruler in the back of their mind. So they are relativistic at times, but at other times they're not, because they refer back to the ruler in the back of their head that they don't know it's there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Comment.
Yeah. When you posit two objects, you're already also assuming a common space.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, just go with me with my illustration. And of course you're right. All right, other thoughts? Omar, are you about to say something there?
Yeah, I'm going to speak general. Think about our society. It seems like the ruler is mob mentality. Like, if we say this is true today, that's the ruler, and the mob may shift a few years later.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how many fingers do I have? I have 5, because I said so, even though you see 4.
Yeah.
Because the majority is saying that's what it is.
Yeah.
So it's a moving ruler.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing, and you know, there's scientific research, there's social science research that talks about what does peer pressure do to us. And there's actually a study where they lined up a group of people, and they had 10 cans or 10 objects out here, and they asked the first person, how many objects do you see? Oh, I see 9. And the last person in the line of 10 is the only one who doesn't know what's going on. The other 9 are in cahoots with the researcher. And every person said, I see 9, I see 9, you know, bottles of beer or whatever. I see 9, 9, 9, 9. And then they say, what will the last person do? And they're, and it turns out that a sizable percentage of people will say, I see 9. So it's the power of groupthink is incredible. And if we allow the division of our country and the political way in which this has all been working out to set the context for our discussion, we're going to be stuck, right? And so I'm advocating for a way that says we need to think in an entirely new and biblically grounded way that will kind of throw our culture off. Both the super right wing and the super left wing folks are going to be like, wait a second, you believe in God, but you also are a thinking person. How can that even be? Dana.
I think another thing about this that I'm intrigued by is the idea of societal function. In order to have a society and work together, we've got to have rules that we agree on.
Yeah.
Patterns of behavior that we agree on. I mean, I don't hold out my hand to you and you're just gonna go, what's your problem? You know, unless we know what we're supposed to do with that and what it means.
Right.
So it's like, we're also, the fact that society is changing is also creating a thirst for the sense of being part. We are the loneliest age.
Oh, for sure.
In the history of you know, that we have kept records. So how do we use that too? If we can't agree on, okay, the stoplight when it's red really does mean stop.
Yeah.
We all have to go. It's not subjective. If you don't feel like stopping, I'm sorry. If we don't stop, we're gonna kill each other. So, I mean, how can we use that in terms of that as also as an inroad to this
I agree with
discussion?
you 100%, and I don't think it's merely convention, like drive on the left side versus drive on the right side of the road. That's merely convention.
Right.
I think there are moral principles that allow society to function as well.
That's what.
Yeah. And for me, in our context, one of the most powerful pieces of that is to say, we believe that every person is made in God's image, that every person counts, even the unborn. And that is because God exists, God created, God cares and loves and affirms the value of each person, even those who maybe aren't as talented as somebody else. Therefore, we believe that it is important for us to treat all persons with justice and mercy. That's what the Bible tells us to do. Okay. There are folks out on the left who deny God But for them, justice is the most important value of all. And my question to you is, where do you get that principle of justice? Historically and theologically, that comes from the New Testament. It is the New Testament that teaches us that every person, including the unborn, is of value and needs to be treated with justice. So that's an example of how our society has gone off the rails, and yet interesting, there is both a thirst for the Lord, I believe, and also a need for the Lord in terms of understanding a moral environment that makes community possible. I need to wrap up with a final criticism here, and we're going to keep our eye on the clock, sadly, but just bear with me here. The third thing I want to say is that the facts are not 100% clear. That is to say, when we are trying to support a theory, the technical way of saying this is that the facts underdetermine the paradigms. So the facts are not 100% conclusive. It is a matter of probability. Okay? In the world of people who think about this, it's common to say that facts are theory-laden. Okay? So the facts do not provide the kind of absolute 100% certitude that Descartes was looking for. At a purely rational point of view, even scientific hypotheses are matters of probability. But here's the problem with perspectivism, is that the ambiguity of facts is overstated. So we need a middle way that recognizes that facts are somewhat ambiguous, but they are not totally ambiguous. The reasons are not so solid that there's just no room for any question at all, and yet, at the other hand, we shouldn't say that the facts are completely ambiguous. So let me think, for example, of the duck-rabbit figure. Does this ring a bell for you? Mm-hmm. It's this pencil pen drawing, you know, that if you look at it one way, it's a duck, you look at it the other way, it's the rabbit, and, you know, which is it? There are some other figures like that. I just saw one yesterday that is an elephant and a tree. It's kind of crazy. Maybe you'll see that in some newsfeed before too long. But the very point of the duck-rabbit figure is that it is exceptional in its ambiguity. People will pose that and say, see, this is the way the world is. It's completely ambiguous. You can look at it this way, you can look at it that way, who knows? But the ambiguity of the duck-rabbit figure is a neat example precisely because it is way more ambiguous than the real world is ambiguous. So from our perspective as Christian theologians then, what I want to suggest is that we acknowledge that the world is not absolutely clear on every single point, and yet, along the lines of your analogy, we can have an understanding of the Christian faith that gathers together evidence in the best possible way. And what I would want to say is that the Christian worldview does the best job. It is the best explanation for the natural world, for human history, and for human experience. So when you look at all these domains of evidence, what you have in the Christian explanation of life in this world, the best way of looking at all these things. So in the natural world, we have, for example, all of the domains of science, including, you know, biology and physics and whatnot. In the historical world, we have both sort of the ancient pagan history, but we also have New Testament history. And the reliability of the New Testament historically is astounding. Okay? And in the realm of human experience, we have sociology, anthropology, and psychology. So why is it that when a person is left by themselves, they don't flourish? children who are not loved, newborns who are not held close, skin to skin, and loved and cherished and held and nurtured, they don't flourish. They experience something called failure to flourish. And why is that? The Christian explanation is because God is a Trinity and He has created us in His image, and we are made for relationship. And when we don't experience relationship, we fail to flourish. So, when you look at the various worldviews and ask the question, which one can build a tower with the guy wires that create stability and meaning and explain the world as we see it and make sense out of the things that we experience, the Christian worldview does the best job overall of making that kind of a case. So there are different perspectives, but the problem with perspectivism is it overstates the differences, and instead we should recognize that we have, as human beings, enough common ground in our experience of the world that we can begin to build a case for the meaningfulness, the reasonableness, and the truth of the Christian worldview.